Good morning, Kipsters. Mr. Franklin here, coming to you live from my first floor studio. Let me zip up my jacket here. Today we're going to continue our work with World War II, and we're going to be talking specifically about African Americans during World War II, what their contributions were, what life was like, what happened on the home front, what happened when they were at war. Let me sip my coffee here. Yummy. I hope everybody's awake. Doing well. We had pretty good engagement yesterday, highest amount of engagement we've had so far. I'm going to remind you, if we get to 90% engagement, Mr. Franklin is going to shave his head live on YouTube on a stream for you guys. Yes, it's going to be great. We're going to get there. All right, let's get right into our presentation, talking about African Americans during World War II. All right. So the first concept that you need to be aware of is this concept called double V. So this is going to come up when you guys are in high school and you're taking AP US History. Double V was a slogan, and it was a thing that African Americans would talk about, discuss, and write about. And double V meant double victory. That meant victory against enemies abroad and victory at home, insofar as we're talking about victory in the civil rights sphere. So African Americans wanted victory against our foreign enemies, but also victory against those who would oppress them domestically. An interesting sort of sociological issue to think about is that the phrase ensured that it was clear that African Americans were Americans, were fully invested into the society, but on the other hand, they weren't going to settle for their rights, their livelihoods, their dignity being trampled. So they were going to get victory in Europe and the Pacific, and victory at home against segregation, Jim Crow, racism, etc. So please make sure you understand when you're reading today the concept of double victory. So essentially, African Americans at the time that the war broke out were second-class citizens. We know that in 1941, the South and the North was heavily segregated. The South segregated by law and by fact, and the North, for the most part, segregated by fact, de facto. The NAACP put pressure on President Roosevelt, and President Roosevelt ensured that black people would be able to enlist in the military. It was important to black leaders and African Americans in general that African Americans had a place in the wartime situation. So we have numbers increasing, the military numbers increasing in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and the Coast Guard. The issue was, for the large part, African Americans served in service areas as opposed to combat areas. So during World War II, the amount of black Americans who served in the armed forces was huge. But for the most part, the vast majority of them worked behind the scenes and not in combat. While they participated in the military and supported the war effort, they still were faced with housing issues, service issues, and even if they were injured, God forbid, they would have segregated blood banks. This is going to slowly start to change, and it happens during World War II. And we're going to talk specifically about the Tuskegee Airmen. So the Tuskegee Airmen were a quote-unquote experimental group of black pilots, and they were based in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1941. It was a program, the Tuskegee Airmen was an Army Corps program to train African Americans to fly and maintain combat aircraft. There were 996 black pilots, navigators, bombardiers, maintenance and support staff, and instructors, and there were more than 15,000 personnel who kept the planes and pilots in the air. The Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington, we've talked about, became the center for African American aviation during World War II. And their exemplary service opened the door for racial integration of the military service. Essentially, the Tuskegee Airmen was started by a group of sympathetic white military personnel, white congressmen who pressured Roosevelt to start this program as an experiment. And what it did was it obviously proved that African Americans could be just as good pilots as white Americans. Now, here's why this experiment happened in the Air Force, or with airplanes, excuse me. If black people are going to show that they can be just as good in the military as whites, it needs to take place in an arena in the military where there is a high degree of technical knowledge necessary, a high degree of physical skill necessary, and a high degree of, really just intelligence. Pilots at the time were essentially the best and the brightest of the military. And the fact that black people showed that they were capable as whites in excelling in the Air Force showed that there was no branch or no part of the military in which they couldn't succeed and be excellent soldiers. So we look back on the Tuskegee Airmen as brave individuals, pioneers, and gentlemen who stepped outside of their comfort zone in order to pave the way for African Americans, not only in the military but also in society. Right? If they show that they're able and capable in this arena, it shows they're able and capable in other arenas in society. All right, what happened during civil rights with African Americans? Well, this was also obviously in the 40s was still part of the Great Migration, and as we saw yesterday, we talked about the many millions. We had something like 15 million Americans joining the military. Think about this. If we have millions of Americans leaving their jobs, joining the military, going overseas to fight, that's going to open up jobs in all throughout the country. And black Americans are going to have a huge push to flee north. We're going to have about 1.6 million blacks who are going to be moving north at this time, fleeing the harsh segregation of the South. That's going to create social upheaval in the South, right? Because the economic systems in the South are still dependent on black labor. And if you have a huge pool of African Americans leaving the South, that's going to increase racial tension, that's going to increase social tension, and it's going to lead to these situations that are going to cause African Americans even more to want to fight back against Southern and even American racist situations. So race relations at the time became a national issue. Probably the most important black leader as far as the civil rights movement was concerned in the 1940s was A. Philip Randolph. He was, if you remember the March on Washington that took place in the 60s where Martin Luther King Jr. Gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, that march actually was supposed to happen in the 40s. And he basically threatened President Roosevelt with a giant march on Washington in 1941. And essentially, Roosevelt didn't want this. He didn't want any kind of sort of signs of disunity. Now think about this. We were fighting during World War I, the Japanese and the Germans. And the Germans were notorious for the way that they treated people of other races. It was embarrassing to the United States on an international level that we were fighting the Nazis and fighting against their racist ideologies while having racist ideologies in our country. So Roosevelt sort of felt very pressured to give in to A. Philip Randolph to not have this gigantic march on Washington, which didn't happen in 1941. So he essentially signed an executive order that forbade discrimination in the defense industries. Also, the Fair Employment Practice Committee was created to make sure that any company that worked on creating manufacturing things in the military was not segregating. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, their membership shot up to 500,000. And in 1942, James Farmer's Congress on Racial Equality, which was based out of Chicago, was started. So here you see this major event of World War II set into motion the seeds. I guess you could say the seeds were planted in many ways. Now, of course, the civil rights movement was, the black struggle for freedom and equality didn't start in 1941, but many major events which caused it to grow took place because of World War II. All right, so that is your presentation for today. Today, you're going to be working on your Google form. I need you to make sure you are being very diligent in your work today. I'm going to start having office hours. In fact, tomorrow I'll have my first set of office hours. You got to make sure, this is very important. I'm going to actually ask this question. I have this giant 70%. So here's the question I'm going to ask. I have this giant 70% on my screen because you have to get 70% of your questions correctly on my assignment, at least 70%, in order to get credit for it. So do not rush. 70% have to be correct in order for you to make sure that you are getting credit. If you've done the work but it's marked as incomplete, that's probably because you didn't get 70%. All right, that's going to be a question on your assignment today. All right, guys, you have a good night, good day, happy Wednesday. We will see you tomorrow.